All right, so get this. We're diving into 1976, this new book by Jorge Majfud.
Oh, wow, the author of The Wild Frontier.
Exactly. And get this, this one is, well, it's being called a nonfiction novel.
Interesting.
Yeah, every single detail is sourced from documented facts.
Oh, wow, so it's 1976. But
yeah, but it's not just 1976. It's got all these flashbacks to like the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even stuff in the decades that follow.
So he's using like this one year as a lens to kind of examine decades of history.
Yeah. He's not just like rehashing events. It's all about connecting the dots.
Right.
Weaving this like intricate tapestry of like seemingly unrelated events, but they all come together.
Yeah, it's a bigger picture.
Okay, so imagine this. The FBI's most wanted terrorists are allegedly being protected by the CIA.
Oh, wow.
And other intelligence agencies down in Latin America. We're talking Cold War tensions, political maneuvering, covert operations.
Yeah.
You know.
And it's important to remember that during the Cold War, like, the lines between good and bad could get really blurry.
Yeah, exactly.
It was such a time of intense ideological conflict. And sometimes it felt like the ends justified the means.
Yeah.
Even if it meant working with individuals who were, by definition, terrorists.
It makes you wonder about the choices made back then.
Yeah.
And like what kind of ripple effects they still have on us today. And the backdrop for all of this is two major events in 1976.
Okay.
The assassination of Orlando Letelier right here in D.C.
Oh, wow.
And the bombing of Cubana Flight 455.
The civilian plane.
Yeah, with 73 people on board, a whole team of young athletes.
These weren't just isolated incidents, though, right?
No, they were pieces of a much bigger puzzle.
Yeah, a much more disturbing puzzle.
So to kick things off, Majfud drops us right into January 1976.
Okay.
Henry Kissinger is sitting in Congress during President Ford's final State of the Union address.
Okay.
Ford's talking about America's bicentennial celebration, but outside it's a totally different scene.
Right.
Snow's falling. A Chevrolet is driving through Bethesda, and there's this sense of unease. You, as the reader, know something Kissinger doesn't this year is about to explode. With violence and international intrigue.
I like how he uses this, like, seemingly ordinary scene to set the stage.
Right.
It's creating this atmosphere of anticipation, like the calm before the storm.
Yeah. Hold on tight, things are about to get real.
Yeah.
And then to help us like navigate this world, Majfud introduces this idea of nests of assassins.
Okay. Nests of assassins.
Yeah, operating in the 1970s, he quotes a journalist who describes four main nests: Cuban exiles, Venezuelan intelligence.
Which is DISIP.
Yeah, Chilean intelligence, DNA. And get this, the CIA.
Wow.
Now, according to this journalist, the FBI considered all of them terrorists.
Really?
But here's the twist. Some were legal and untouchable.
So we're talking about groups labeled as terrorists by the FBI, but some were allegedly operating with the support or at least the tacit approval of the U.S. government.
Yeah, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about the good guys and the bad guys.
Right.
Right. And it begs the question, what happens when the very people tasked with fighting terrorism might be complicit in its existence?
Yeah, that's a good question.
To really grasp the dynamics at play, we got to rewind the clock even further.
Okay.
Majfud takes us to 1946, Havana, picture mobsters, casinos, Frank Sinatra strolling in with millions of dollars in a suitcase.
No way, Frank Sinatra.
Guarded by Al Capone's cousins.
Wow.
So this is pre-revolution. Cuba, American organized crime, was so deeply embedded that it helps us understand like the power dynamics.
Yeah, forces at play.
Yeah, and the forces that would later shape the exile community.
So how does this all tie back to those nests of assassins that we were talking about?
Well, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, many connected to the Batista regime, including figures from that Havana Mafia, fled to Florida.
Oh, wow.
They formed a powerful exile community fueled by a fierce anti-communism and a longing to reclaim their homeland.
Right.
This community, in many ways, became a breeding ground for radical groups.
So these are the groups that were trained by the CIA to overthrow Castro.
Some of them, yes. Majfud outlines like the evolution of this community.
Yeah.
From the 50s through the 70s and into the 80s and beyond.
Okay.
In the 60s, you had that initial wave of exiles, many trained by the CIA, involved in operations like the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Right.
But those attempts failed, and in the late 60s and 70s, things took a darker turn. That's when we see a surge in bombings and assassinations, often without direct CIA oversight.
And then in the 80s and beyond, they transitioned to wielding influence in U.S. Congress.
Yeah.
Lobbying for policies against Castro's regime.
So their tactics evolved over time, but that core goal of toppling Castro remained constant.
It's interesting to see how they shifted from covert operations to political maneuvering.
Exactly. And it's important to note that not every member of the Cuban exile community embraced violence.
Of course.
Many just wanted to rebuild their lives and advocated for peaceful change in Cuba.
Yeah.
But the presence of these radical groups, some with alleged ties to intelligence agencies, created a climate of fear and mistrust, both within the community and in their interactions with the U.S. government.
Okay, so let's bring Orlando Letelier back into the picture.
Okay.
He was a Chilean diplomat, part of Salvador Allende's government.
Right, the socialist president who was overthrown in that CIA-backed coup in 1973.
Yes, and Letelier's story is tragic. After the coup, he was imprisoned and tortured by Pinochet's regime.
Oh, wow.
International pressure eventually secured his release, and he ended up in Washington, D.C., working at the Institute for Policy Studies, a pretty progressive think tank.
And this is where his path intersects with those nests of assassins.
He became a vocal critic of Pinochet's regime, using his platform to denounce human rights abuses and advocate for democracy in Chile.
Talk about a brave move, especially considering what was happening around him.
Absolutely. Letelier was a serious thorn in the side of the Pinochet regime, and they were determined to silence him.
Yeah.
But they didn't act alone. This is where Michael Townley enters the picture. A CIA agent working for DINENE, the Chilean secret police.
So Townley was the mastermind behind Letelier's assassination.
That's right, with alleged support from DINENE and possibly even elements within the CIA. Townley orchestrated this meticulous plan to eliminate Letelier.
Wow.
This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was cold, calculated, designed to send a message.
Like, criticize Pinochet and you will pay the price.
Exactly.
And pay the price he did September 21st, 1976, right here in D.C. Letelier and his young American colleague Ronnie Moffett are killed by a car bomb.
Oh, wow.
Just blocks from the Chilean embassy.
This wasn't some back alley hit. This was a brazen act of terrorism.
Yeah, in broad daylight in the heart of the U.S. Capitol.
The global outrage was immense. Can you imagine the shock waves?
Yeah.
A prominent diplomat assassinated on American soil by agents of a foreign government with potential links to U.S. intelligence.
It raised serious questions about the U.S. government's involvement with repressive regimes.
Yeah.
And like how far these regimes are willing to go.
It's chilling to think about.
Yeah, Letelier's assassination really exposed the dark underbelly of the Cold War.
The intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and the devastating human cost.
And tragically, Letelier's assassination wasn't the only act of terror linked to these nests of assassins that year.
Oh, no.
Just a few weeks later, on October 6, 1976, Cubana Flight 455 was blown out of the sky off the coast of Barbados.
This one is heartbreaking.
Yeah, the plane was carrying 73 people, including a group of young athletes returning from a fencing competition in Venezuela.
Can you imagine?
The excitement, the anticipation.
Yeah.
Only to have it all cut short.
By such a senseless act of violence.
The bombing was allegedly orchestrated by Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles.
Okay.
Two prominent figures in the Cuban exile community with possible ties to the CIA and other intelligence agencies.
So two horrific acts of terrorism, both in 1976, both allegedly connected to these nests of assassins.
Yeah.
Both revealing this complex and deeply unsettling reality of the Cold War.
It's hard to wrap your head around it all.
It is, and this is where Mahfoud's book really shines.
Yeah.
He doesn't just present these events as isolated incidents, he meticulously connects them. Right.
He draws lines between the Cuban exile community, the Chilean secret police, the CIA, even Venezuelan intelligence.
That's like he's unraveling a conspiracy.
But it's all based on documented facts.
Yeah.
Not speculation. He's presenting this intricate web of connections, and it's up to us, the readers, to grapple with the implications.
Exactly. And that's what makes 1976 such a powerful read. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history.
About the messy realities of political violence and the enduring impact of exile, trauma, and ideology.
There's a lot to digest, for sure. And we've only just scratched the surface of what Mahfoud uncovers. There's so much more to explore.
Right.
The investigations into Letelier's assassination, the alleged CIA connections to the Cubana flight bombing, the tangled relationships between these nests of assassins and various governments and intelligence agencies.
It's a complex story, one that challenges our assumptions about history, about power, and the true cost of ideological conflict.
It makes you wonder how much influence governments and intelligence agencies really have over individuals and groups.
Yeah. And to what lengths those groups will go to achieve their goals, even if it means resorting to violence.
Absolutely, and I think that's a question worth pondering as we delve deeper into this fascinating yet unsettling period of history.
Okay, so to understand these nests of assassins better, Mahfoud takes us even further back in time, introducing us to a key figure, Rolando Masfer.
Masfer is such a fascinating character. He embodies the complexities and contradictions of this era.
Yeah.
He was a former Cuban senator and businessman, a powerful figure in pre-revolution Cuba.
Right.
But after the revolution, he became a staunch anti-communist and allegedly a key player in violent exile groups.
So he's a product of the upheaval, like transformed by the revolution?
Precisely, and Masfer's actions demonstrate the radicalizing effects of exile,
Mm-hmm.
the way political activism can blur into criminal activity and that seductive allure of violence as a means to achieve political ends.
Yeah.
He's a cautionary tale about how ideology unchecked can lead to devastating consequences.
So Mahfoud takes us back to 1960, where Masfer, operating out of Miami, allegedly orchestrated a devastating attack on a French ship, the Cubra, docked in Havana.
Right.
The ship was carrying arms and ammunition for the Cuban government.
This attack was significant for several reasons. First, over 100 people were killed.
Wow.
Many of them dock workers and bystanders caught in the explosions.
Oh my gosh.
It's a stark reminder of the indiscriminate nature of violence, the way it can rip through innocent lives,
Yeah.
leaving behind unimaginable pain and suffering.
It's hard to fathom that level of disregard for human life.
Right.
And this attack on La Cubra, did it set a precedent for future acts of terror by exile groups?
It did. It established a pattern of targeting civilian infrastructure and innocent people as a way to destabilize the Cuban government and instill fear.
Yeah.
And the attack on La Cubra also raises questions about the murky world of intelligence operations.
Here we go again with the murky world. What do we know about potential CIA involvement in this?
Well, there were allegations at the time, and Mahfoud explores these in detail, that the CIA might have been involved, whether through providing support or simply turning a blind eye to the operation. The extent of their involvement remains unclear,
Yeah.
but the possibility alone raises serious concerns about the lengths to which they were willing to go to undermine Castro's regime.
It's like this constant dance between fighting terrorism and potentially fueling it.
Yeah.
The lines are so blurred that it becomes almost impossible to distinguish between the two.
Exactly, and these blurred lines only become more pronounced as we move through the 1960s and into the 1970s.
This is the period when exile groups, particularly Cuban exiles, became increasingly active, right?
Yes.
We see this surge in bombings, assassinations, and other acts of violence, not just in Cuba, but also in the U.S. and throughout Latin America.
It's like the violence that was simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over.
You're right, and as Mahfoud meticulously documents, these groups weren't operating in a vacuum. They had alleged ties to various intelligence agencies, including the CIA, and their actions were often intertwined with the larger geopolitical struggles of the Cold War.
It's a web of intrigue and manipulation that's difficult to unravel.
Mahfoud paints a chilling picture of this era, bombs exploding in Miami, exile leaders being targeted by their own comrades, and this growing sense of paranoia and mistrust within the Cuban exile community.
Yeah, it's like this dark, twisted mirror image of the American dream.
Yeah.
A community driven to extremes by their longing for a lost homeland.
It was a time of intense ideological fervor fueled by a deep hatred for Castro and communism.
But it was also a time of manipulation, betrayal, and too often senseless violence.
It's a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked extremism and the lasting damage that can be inflicted when ideology trumps humanity.
The human cost of these conflicts is often overlooked.
Yeah.
But Mahfoud makes sure we don't forget the real people whose lives were shattered by these events.
And these themes become even more pronounced as we delve deeper into the stories of Orlando Letelier and the bombing of Cubana Flight 455.
All right, let's take a closer look at those events and the investigations that followed.
They reveal some truly shocking revelations about the extent of the covert operations and the lengths to which those in power were willing to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Buckle up.
Yeah. Welcome back. So we've been talking about the volatile climate of the 1970s, particularly within the Cuban exile community.
Yeah, and as we dig deeper into these events surrounding Orlando Letelier and Cubana Flight 455,
Right.
those blurred lines we talked about become even more prominent.
They do.
Let's start with the Letelier assassination. The investigation was led by U.S. prosecutor Eugene Proper.
Okay.
It sounds like something straight out of a spy novel.
Yeah.
I mean, a murder on U.S. soil, connections to the Chilean secret police,
Right.
whispers of CIA involvement. Where do you even begin to untangle something like that?
It was incredibly complex and politically charged.
Yeah.
Proper faced roadblocks at every turn.
Like what?
Uncooperative foreign governments, the inherent secrecy surrounding intelligence operations.
Yeah.
It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
And Mahfoud details the Pinochet regime's efforts to obstruct the investigation.
Oh, wow.
Disinformation campaigns, denials of involvement, even trying to pin the blame on leftist groups.
It's a classic case of a government using propaganda and manipulation to protect its interests.
But despite these challenges, Proper and his team, including FBI agents Robert Scherer and Carter Cornick,
Okay.
they were determined to uncover the truth.
They meticulously pieced together the evidence,
Yeah.
tracing financial trails, identifying key players in the plot. It was a painstaking process.
And their persistence paid off right.
Yeah.
They eventually uncovered the truth behind the assassination.
They did. The investigation ultimately led them to Michael Townley, that CIA agent working for Dana.
Right.
He confessed to his role in the assassination, providing detailed information about the bomb, the planning, the individuals involved.
So Townley flipped, and his confession blew the whole thing wide open.
His testimony was explosive. It confirmed what many had suspected. Letelier's assassination was a state-sponsored act of terrorism,
Wow.
orchestrated by a foreign government on U.S. soil.
It's a chilling reminder of how far some regimes are willing to go to silence their critics,
Right.
even if it means violating international law and committing acts of terror in another country.
And the implications went far beyond Chile.
Yeah.
Townley's confession revealed the existence of Operation Condor, a clandestine network of South American dictatorships,
Oh, wow.
allegedly backed by the U.S. that coordinated intelligence operations, including assassinations and disappearances, to eliminate political opponents.
So it wasn't just one rogue regime. It was a network of dictatorships operating with a chilling level of impunity.
And potentially with the knowledge and support of the U.S. government?
It raises profound questions about the role of the U.S. in supporting repressive regimes during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, especially considering the U.S.'s supposed commitment to democracy and human rights. So what happened to Townley after his confession?
Yeah, did he face any real consequences for his actions?
He struck a deal with the U.S. government in exchange for his testimony.
Okay.
He served a relatively short prison sentence and was placed in the Witness Protection Program.
Wait, that's it. A short sentence and a new identity
Yeah.
for orchestrating the assassination of a diplomat on U.S. soil.
It was a controversial outcome,
Yeah.
with many arguing that he got off too lightly considering the gravity of his crimes.
Right.
But it also speaks to the murky world of intelligence operations and international politics,
Yeah.
where justice can be elusive and those with powerful connections often escape accountability.
It's a reminder that sometimes the pursuit of larger political goals can overshadow the need for individual accountability.
So let's shift our focus to the bombing of Cubana Flight 455.
Okay.
Mahfud describes the investigation into this tragedy as even more complex and frustrating than the Letelier case.
Really?
It was incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
Imagine the initial chaos and confusion, the painstaking process of recovering the wreckage from the ocean floor.
Right. And the difficulties of piecing together evidence in a multinational investigation spanning multiple countries.
And like the Letelier case, there were attempts to obstruct justice, spread disinformation, and shield those responsible.
Yes. But unlike the Letelier case, there was never a definitive conclusion. No smoking gun that directly pointed to those behind the bombing.
So despite the lack of a clear-cut resolution, the evidence strongly suggests the involvement of Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles.
Right, those figures in the Cuban exile community we discussed earlier.
We're talking about the same Bosch who was suspected of plotting to assassinate Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
And Posada Carriles, wasn't he connected to Venezuelan intelligence?
That's right. Both men had extensive histories of anti-Castro activism and alleged ties to violence. Posada Carriles had worked for DICIP, the Venezuelan intelligence service, and was known for his ruthlessness. Mahfud meticulously presents a compelling case for their involvement in the bombing, uncovering financial connections, witness testimonies.
And even boasts from Bosch and Posada Carriles themselves about their roles in bringing down Castro's planes.
It's infuriating to think that these individuals, allegedly responsible for the deaths of 73 innocent people, could operate with such impunity.
Yeah.
And not just operate, but brag about their actions.
Yeah.
Where was the justice for the victims and their families?
The lack of accountability in this case is truly appalling.
Yeah.
It speaks to the power of ideology to blind individuals to the consequences of their actions,
Right.
and highlights the failure of justice systems to hold those responsible for acts of terrorism accountable.
And in this case, that failure of justice is compounded by the alleged involvement of intelligence agencies. Mahfoud presents evidence, though circumstantial, that points to possible CIA knowledge of or even support for the bombing plot.
Again, we're confronted with those blurred lines.
Right.
Was the CIA directly involved? Did they simply look the other way?
Yeah.
Or were they outsmarted by Bosch and Posada Carriles? These questions remain unanswered, and they cut to the heart of the debate about the CIA's role in covert operations during the Cold War.
It's a morally ambiguous landscape. And to Mahfoud's credit, he doesn't shy away from these uncomfortable truths. He presents the evidence, lays out the connections, and allows us as readers to grapple with these difficult questions.
The bombing of Cubana Flight 455 was a tragedy that exposed the dark underbelly of the Cold War. The complex web of relationships between exile groups, intelligence agencies, and governments, and the devastating human cost of this ideological battle.
It's a lot to absorb, for sure. But it's vital to understand these events, to confront the darkness of the past, and to learn from the mistakes that were made.
As we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the aftermath of these events, the legacy of those nests of assassins, and the lingering questions about justice, accountability, and the role of the U.S. in the world.
We've been talking about some pretty intense stuff, right? The Letelier assassination, the Cubana Flight bombing, these nests of assassins.
It's heavy stuff.
It really is. Leaves you with a lot to think about.
Yeah, and kind of a knot in your stomach.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1976, what happened after these events? What became of Bosch and Posada Carriles?
Well, the answer, unfortunately, isn't so simple. They were initially arrested in Venezuela, but never extradited to the U.S. to face charges.
Wait, they were arrested but never stood trial for the bombing.
Yeah, it's complicated. You see, it speaks to the challenges of international relations and the power of political influence. Bosch was eventually released due to lack of evidence, while Posada Carriles, well, he managed to escape from prison.
He escaped.
He did, and eventually made his way to the U.S. He lived openly in Miami until his death in 2011.
So the alleged mastermind behind this horrific bombing escaped justice and lived freely in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a tough reality. It highlights the failures of both the Venezuelan and U.S. justice systems to hold those responsible accountable.
It's a slap in the face to the victims and their families.
Absolutely. It raises questions about how political ideologies and alliances can influence legal proceedings.
What about the families? Did they ever find any closure?
Mahfoud really focuses on the human impact. He talks about the families of the victims both in Chile and Cuba, and their stories are heartbreaking.
It's hard to imagine coping with that kind of loss.
They had to deal with immense grief and the frustration of knowing that justice wasn't being served.
It's unimaginable.
It really is, but their strength and resilience is remarkable. They continued to fight for truth and accountability.
How so?
They organized memorial events, lobbied governments, and kept the memory of their loved ones alive. They refused to let their stories be forgotten.
It's a reminder that justice can exist beyond the courtroom.
Exactly. It's about the unwavering determination to uncover the truth and honor the memory of those lost.
Throughout this whole story, the role of the U.S. government is hard to ignore.
It is. Mahfoud presents evidence that the CIA and other U.S. agencies were at least aware of, if not complicit, in the activities of these nests of assassins.
It's a difficult truth to confront.
It is the idea that the U.S. might have been involved in supporting or enabling acts of terrorism is jarring.
It makes you reevaluate the moral complexities of the Cold War.
Definitely. It's a reminder that even in the fight against a perceived evil, the lines between right and wrong can get blurred.
Mahfoud doesn't shy away from these uncomfortable truths.
He lays it all out, the evidence, the contradictions, and leaves us to grapple with the implications.
So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways from 1976?
Well, the book highlights the lasting impact of exile and trauma, how it shapes individuals and communities.
Like the Cuban exile community, their desire to reclaim their homeland fueled extremism and violence.
Right. And for the Chilean exiles, the trauma of imprisonment and torture, the challenge of rebuilding their lives.
It's a reminder that political upheaval has far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. Another takeaway is the dark side of the Cold War. Those blurred lines between state and non-state actors, the shadowy world of intelligence operations.
It makes you question the methods used, the alliances formed, and the consequences of those decisions.
And lastly, 1976 reminds us that justice can be a long and arduous process.
But it also shows the resilience of those fighting for accountability.
Exactly. It's about strength and perseverance in the face of immense challenges.
So 1976, it's a powerful and thought-provoking book.
It really is. It's a reflection on human nature, political violence, and the struggle for truth and justice.
If you're looking for a book that will challenge you and make you think this is it.
It's a journey into a dark and complex period, but a journey worth taking.
1976 by Jorge Majfud. Check it out.
It reminds us that the past shapes our present and we need to learn from history.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 1976. We hope you learned something new.
Keep exploring and keep questioning.
Until next time.